is one of about 150 psychiatric hospitals in the country.
Fires, shock therapy, and some of the most inhumane treatments inflicted on humans. We're talking about all of this and more as we dive into some of the most terrifying tales from abandoned psychiatric hospitals. The Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, later known as Friern Hospital, was once Europe's largest mental health facility, designed with grand ambitions, but ultimately overshadowed by tragedy. Opened in 1851, the asylum quickly became overcrowded, housing over 3,000 patients at its peak in conditions that steadily deteriorated. However, the most horrifying chapter in Colney Hatch's history occurred on January 27, 1903, when a massive fire broke out, fueled by the asylum's wooden wards and overcrowded conditions. The fire spread rapidly, trapping many patients inside. In one of the worst peacetime fires in London's history, 52 women perished, some burned alive in their beds, while others were found huddled in corners, their attempts to escape futile against the raging flames. The Hornsey Fire Brigade arrived, but their efforts to douse the fire were too late to prevent the tragedy. The grim aftermath of the fire left a very dark mark on the history of the hospital, which continued to operate under the name Friern Hospital until its closure in 1993. Today, the site has been transformed into luxury apartments, but the tragic events of that fateful night remain a haunting reminder of its past. I love that. Just a horrible tragedy, and they're like, now, here are the most expensive apartments you've ever seen. Wouldn't you love to live here? Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey is steeped in eerie tales, but one of the most tragic stories is not just a legend, but a real one. That of folk singer Woody Guthrie. In the 1950s, Guthrie was admitted to Greystone after being diagnosed with Huntington's disease, a degenerative neurological disorder. Once a vibrant, influential musician known for his songs about social justice and the American experience, Guthrie spent his final years confined to the hospital's bleak wards as his condition deteriorated. The real haunting at Greystone isn't a ghost in a white gown, but the memory of Guthrie's tragic decline. Visitors to the now abandoned hospital often speak of a lingering sadness, as if the walls still echo with the strains of the songs he could no longer sing. Some have even reported hearing faint music in the quietest corners of the building, almost as if Guthrie's spirit remains, strumming his guitar and singing about the struggles of ordinary people. The Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane in New York, which opened its doors in 1869, has a chilling reputation that lingers long after its closure. The first patient, Mary wrote, was described as, quote, demented and deformed, having spent 10 years confined in an almshouse before arriving at Willard. Her story set the tone for many of the patients who would follow, often transferred from horrific conditions such as being shackled in cells or transported in chicken crates. Willard became a dumping ground for those deemed undesirable, with patients suffering from a range of afflictions, from severe mental and physical disabilities to really vague diagnoses like nervousness or feeble-mindedness. Among the asylum's many haunted corners, the most unsettling is the so-called silent ward, a place where the air is unnaturally still and no sound seems to break the eerie quiet. Ghost hunters who have ventured into this ward report a profound silence that is almost suffocating, as if time itself has stopped. Even the most skeptical visitors have felt an uncanny sense of being watched, and some have caught glimpses of figures in outdated clothing slowly drifting down the hallways. Athens Lunatic Asylum, better known as the Ridges in Ohio, built in 1868, this asylum was notorious for its overcrowded conditions and brutal treatments such as lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and hydrotherapy, where patients were subjected to extreme temperatures or electric shocks that sometimes broke their bones. The main legend from this horrific place centers around Margaret Schilling, a patient who vanished in the asylum's complex maze of buildings one cold December day in 1978. After an extensive search, her lifeless body was discovered in a locked, unused ward weeks later. The very tragic details of her death remain a mystery, but what remains visible is the very eerie stain her body left on the floor, an outline that, despite numerous cleaning attempts, refuses to fade. Visitors and ghost hunters claim that Margaret's restless spirit lingers, eternally searching for a way out of the place where she met her very tragic end. Severals Hospital in England is infamous not only for its controversial past involving unethical treatments and severe overcrowding, but also for the horrific psychiatric experiments conducted on its patients. From the 1930s to the 1960s, Severals was a site of countless experiments, including electroconvulsive therapy and lobotomies, where incisions were made in the prefrontal lobe of the brain. These procedures were sometimes performed while patients were fully conscious, which is a horrifying fact I will never be able to forget. The hospital struggled to recruit enough staff, leading to frequent complaints from management, and as a result, patients were often confined to their beds, heavily sedated to keep them quiet and ease the burden on overworked staff, particularly during the 1940s. Imagine this scenario. You are a mentally unwell person, or even just a perfectly healthy woman who was sent to the asylum for something as trivial as having a child out of wedlock. One day, someone comes to strap you to a chair. They pass electricity through your skull, sometimes 6 times at 40 seconds per shock, to render you unconscious. And then they insert surgical instruments through your eyelids to remove part of your brain. Sounds like something out of a horror movie, yet this was the reality for hundreds of patients every year in the name of science. Today, visitors to the now abandoned hospital report hearing disembodied voices and screams echoing through the dilapidated corridors, as if the tormented spirits of those who suffered there are still crying out for justice. Bethlem Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam, was England's first asylum for the treatment of mental illness, and it became notorious for its conditions and cruel treatment of patients. Founded in 1247, the hospital initially reflected the medieval view that mental illness was a physical ailment, leading to barbaric treatments like bleeding, purging, and cold baths to cure patients. However, by the 18th century, Bedlam had earned its fearsome reputation not just for these so-called treatments, but also for becoming a grim tourist attraction. Thousands of visitors paid to wander its wards, taunting and gawking at the, quote, madmen chained to the walls or confined to filthy, overcrowded cells. The conditions inside Bedlam were appalling. Patients were often found naked, restrained in chains, and forced to endure the freezing cold with little more than a thin blanket. One of the most infamous incidents involved James Norris, a patient who had been chained so tightly to a wall for over a decade that his muscles atrophied. Bedlam also became a spectacle of human misery, where the curious public could watch inmates rattle their chains and scream, creating a chaotic environment that did a lot more harm than it did good. These inhumane practices, coupled with the hospital's lack of oversight and accountability, solidified Bedlam's reputation as a place of cruelty and despair, where recovery was unlikely and suffering was just the norm. Ying Psychiatry Hospital, known today as the High Street Haunted House, is one of Hong Kong's most terrifying places, steeped in a dark history that combines colonial medical practices with wartime horrors. Originally the city's largest mental health facility under British rule, the hospital became infamous during World War II when it was reportedly taken over by Japanese forces and used as an execution site for prisoners prisoners of war and civilians who resisted the occupation. Legend has it that the bodies of those executed were secretly buried in the nearby King George's Park, and after the war, the hospital resumed its role in treating Hong Kong's mentally ill until it closed in 1971, leaving the building abandoned for 2 decades. In 1998, the building was partially renovated to become a community complex, yet the chilling stories have persisted. Some say that at night, the spirits of maimed prisoners and the souls of those who suffered in the asylum still roam the corridors. In a more recent twist to its very haunted reputation, a 50-year-old security guard died unexpectedly during his first night on duty in 2019, which only added another layer to the building's very grim lore. Locals continue to avoid the site after dark, believing that the ghosts of the past are still very much present in the old asylum's walls. For the inhabitants of New York City during the Gaslight era, Bellevue Hospital was a name synonymous with dread and despair. This hospital wasn't just a place of healing, it was often seen as a grim last stop for the city's most vulnerable residents. The chances of leaving Bellevue once you entered were slim, and many who crossed its threshold never came back. Founded in 1736 as an almshouse, Bellevue became a refuge for the city's poor and desperate, including immigrants, the mentally ill, and the terminally sick, crammed into overcrowded wards where disease and death were constant companions. Conditions were so dire that nearly half of all patients undergoing amputations died due to infections festering within the hospital's grimy, disgusting walls. However, the hospital's psychiatric ward was perhaps its most feared area. Established in a red brick building constructed in 1931, this facility became infamous for its brutal and experimental treatments. Insulin shock therapy was first used here, and patients were often subjected to neglect and inhumane conditions. The psychiatric unit housed individuals who were largely forgotten by society, but sometimes even had high-profile cases like Mark David Chapman, the man who shot John Lennon. It became a symbol of degradation and hopelessness, a place where the city's unwanted were left to wither away. Today, the old psychiatric building stands mostly abandoned. The Psychiatric Hospital di Volterra in Tuscany, Italy looks like something straight out of a horror movie, with its crumbling walls and eerie abandoned halls. Closed in 1978 due to the cruel treatment of its patients, the asylum is perhaps most famous for the haunting graffiti etched into its walls by Fernando Oreste Nanetti, known as NOF4. A patient in the asylum for many years, Nanetti used the metal buckle of his vest to carve an epic 180-meter-long work into the plaster, detailing his imaginative world, his grievances, and his experiences within the hospital. This haunting masterpiece, often considered a form of art brut or raw art, is filled with words, symbols, and drawings that he painstakingly inscribed over many years, dodging the watchful eyes of the hospital staff. The hospital's history is steeped in suffering. Practices like electroshock therapy, insulin-induced comas, and sedative experiments were common, with complete disregard for the patient's well-being. In the Ferry Pavilion, the psychiatric hospital's judicial section, up to 6,000 patients were all crammed together with only a few sinks and toilets, and they were treated more like prisoners than patients. Nurses were referred to as guards, and the patients were often sedated, isolated, or subjected to ice baths. Hellingly Hospital in East Sussex, England has a dark and unsettling history, but no story is as haunting as the legend of the Screaming Man. According to local lore, this spirit belongs to a former patient who suffered under the brutal conditions of the asylum. Since its abandonment in 1994, Hellingly has become a magnet for ghost hunters and thrill seekers, all eager to experience its haunted reputation. Many who have braved the decaying halls of the old hospital report hearing the chilling sounds of a man screaming in agony, echoing through the empty corridors. Some have even claimed to see a spectral figure in a tattered hospital gown, his face contorted into a silent scream, as if trapped in a perpetual state of fear and pain. Doors have been known to slam shut without warning, and objects mysteriously move as if pushed by unseen hands. Electronic voice phenomena, more commonly known as EVP recordings, have captured faint, anguished voices pleading for help, adding to the belief that the tormented spirits of Hellingly's past are still very much present. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you all again very soon, I'm sure. Goodbye.